The camera was still recording. Ethan Calloway sat in the dim glow of his private office, eyes fixed on the monitor before him. The footage was grainy, black and white, but clear enough to see her. Grace Miller, 27 years old, quiet, almost invisible. The kind of person who moved through rooms like a whisper, never asking for anything, never expecting to be seen. He had hired her 3 weeks ago, and for 3 weeks, he had watched her the way a man watches a storm from behind glass, curious, distant, untouched. But tonight, he had set a trap. On the leather sofa in the grand living room, Ethan had staged the scene carefully, his wallet half open on the coffee table. $300 in cash, fanned out just enough to catch the light. His watch, worth more than most people earned in a year, resting beside it. And him, stretched across the sofa, eyes closed, breathing slow and deep, pretending to sleep. The cameras were hidden in the bookshelves behind the curtains, angled toward the sofa. Marcus, his assistant, had questioned him earlier that evening. "You really think she's going to steal from you?" Ethan hadn't answered. He didn't need to. The world had already taught him what people did when they thought no one was watching. Now, alone in his office, he leaned closer to the screen. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. The door to the living room opened. Grace entered quietly, a cleaning caddy in one hand, her movements careful, rehearsed. She wore the same pale blue uniform she always did, her dark hair pulled back into a simple bun. No makeup, no jewelry, just the faint scent of lavender soap that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She stopped when she saw him. Her eyes moved to the sofa, to the wallet, to the money. Ethan's jaw tightened. Here it comes, he thought. The moment when the mask falls. When kindness reveals itself as calculation. When trust becomes the punchline to a joke he'd heard 1,000 times before. Grace stood there for a long moment, motionless. Then she stepped forward. Ethan's hand hovered over the keyboard, ready to stop the footage, ready to call Marcus, ready to... She picked up the money. His breath caught, but she didn't pocket it. She didn't look around nervously or hesitate. Instead, she folded the bills carefully, tucked them back into the wallet, and placed the wallet beside his watch. Then she picked up a book from the side table, one of his favorites, a worn copy of Steinbeck, and gently covered the wallet with it. Ethan blinked. What the hell is she doing? Grace turned toward him. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Sadness? Gratitude? Something softer than either. Then she crossed the room to the hall closet, pulled out a thick woolen blanket, and returned. She unfolded it slowly, the fabric catching the dim light from the lamp. And then, with a tenderness that felt almost sacred, she draped it over him. Her fingers brushed his shoulder just for a second as she adjusted the blanket, and then she whispered, "Thank you for giving me this job. I won't let you down." Her voice was barely audible, fragile, honest. She stepped back, looked at him one last time, and left the room as quietly as she had entered. The door clicked shut. Ethan sat frozen in his office chair, staring at the screen. The footage continued to roll. Empty room, empty sofa. The blanket rising and falling with his own breathing, captured on camera hours ago. He replayed the scene. Once, twice, 3 times. Each time the same result. The same whisper. The same blanket. He leaned back, his hand covering his mouth. What kind of person does that? He had tested her, waited for her to fail, expected her to prove him right, that everyone, given the chance, would take what wasn't theirs. But she hadn't. She had covered him, protected him, thanked him. The monitor flickered slightly, and Ethan caught his own reflection in the glass. His face looked older than 33, harder, colder. He thought of the last maid who had worked in this house. The one who had smiled warmly at his mother, who had brought her tea when she was sick, who had stayed late and laughed with the staff, the one who had emptied his mother's jewelry box 2 days before she died, the one who had disappeared before anyone could stop her. That betrayal had carved something out of him, something he hadn't known he could lose. And now, 3 years later, here he was, testing a woman who had never given him a reason to doubt her. He closed the laptop. The room fell into silence. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, its surface smooth and still. The Callaway estate stretched across 12 acres of Connecticut wilderness, a fortress of glass and stone built to keep the world at bay. But tonight, for the first time in years, Ethan Callaway felt something crack inside that fortress. Not loud, not violent, just a hairline fracture. A whisper. "Thank you for giving me this job." He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark water. Somewhere in the staff quarters, Grace Miller was probably asleep, probably dreaming of nothing important, probably unaware that she had just done something no one else in his life had managed to do in a very long time. She had surprised him. If this story has already touched your heart in the first minute, subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find stories that heal, inspire, and make you believe in human goodness again. Morning came too early. Ethan hadn't slept. He'd sat in his office until the sky turned gray, replaying the footage until the image of Grace draping that blanket over him was burned into his mind. By the time he showered and dressed, the house was already awake. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the hallways. Somewhere downstairs, Mrs. Turner, the head housekeeper, was barking orders at the kitchen staff, and Grace was probably already working. Ethan descended the grand staircase, his hand trailing along the polished mahogany railing. The estate was enormous, too enormous for one person. 15 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library that could house a small university. His father had built it as a monument to success. His mother had tried to fill it with warmth. After she died, it had become a mausoleum. He found Marcus in the dining room sipping espresso and scrolling through his tablet. "You look like hell," Marcus said without looking up. Ethan poured himself coffee from the silver carafe. "Didn't sleep." "Let me guess. You watched the footage." Ethan didn't respond. Marcus set down his tablet and studied him. "So? Did she steal from you?" "No." "Did she touch the money?" "She covered it with a book." Marcus raised an eyebrow. And then she covered me with a blanket." There was a long pause. "Huh," Marcus said finally. "So you set a trap for a woman who's done nothing wrong and she passed with flying colors. Congratulations. You're officially paranoid." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You didn't see what happened 3 years ago." "I know exactly what happened 3 years ago," Marcus said, his voice gentler now. "Elena stole from your mother. She betrayed your family. And you've been punishing every decent person who's walked through that door ever since. I'm not punishing anyone. You staged a test, Ethan. For a woman who shows up early, works late, never complains, and has been nothing but respectful since the day she got here." Marcus leaned forward. "You know what that is? That's not caution. That's cruelty." The word landed like a slap. Ethan set his cup down carefully. "I'm protecting what's mine." "From what? From someone who just wants to do her job?" Marcus shook his head. "Grace isn't Elena. Stop treating her like she is." Ethan stared into his coffee, the dark liquid reflecting his own distorted face. He wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but the truth was sitting heavy in his chest, and it felt too much like shame. "Where is she now?" Ethan asked quietly. "Library, I think. Mrs. Turner assigned her the East Wing today." Ethan nodded and left the room without another word. He found her an hour later. The library was his favorite room in the house. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a spiral staircase, and tall windows that overlooked the lake. Sunlight poured through the glass, turning the dust motes into floating stars. Grace was on the 2nd floor, balanced on a small ladder, dusting the upper shelves with a soft cloth. She wore the same pale blue uniform, her movements careful and methodical. She didn't hear him enter. Ethan stood at the base of the staircase, watching her. She worked with a kind of quiet reverence, as if each book mattered. as if the work itself had meaning. When she reached a leather-bound volume of poetry, she paused, ran her fingers gently over the spine, then continued. "Do you read?" Ethan's voice cut through the silence. Grace startled, nearly dropping the cloth. She turned, and when she saw him, her face flushed. "Mr. Calloway," she said quickly, descending the ladder, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in." "Don't apologize. I didn't mean to startle you." She stood at the bottom of the ladder now, hands folded in front of her, eyes lowered, the posture of someone who had learned to make herself small. "You asked if I read?" she said softly. "Yes, when I have time. What do you like?" She hesitated, as if unsure whether the question was genuine. "Old things mostly. Steinbeck, Whitman, anything that feels true." Ethan's chest tightened. The book she had used to cover his wallet last night. Steinbeck. "You can borrow anything you want from here," he said. "Any time." Grace looked up at him then, surprise flickering in her dark eyes. "Really?" "Really." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sunlight shifted, and a beam of light fell across her face, illuminating the faint shadows under her eyes, the tiredness she tried to hide. "Thank you," she said finally. "That's very kind." Kind. The word felt foreign in his mouth. "Grace," he said, and her name felt strange on his tongue. He'd called her Miss Miller until now. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, wary now. "Why did you take this job?" She blinked. "I needed work." "That's not what I mean." He stepped closer and she tensed slightly. "You could work anywhere. You're capable. You're thorough. You don't cut corners. So why here? Why work for someone like me?" The question hung in the air. Grace looked down at her hands. "Because you gave me a chance when no one else would." "What does that mean?" She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was let go from my last job, a nursing home in Hartford. They said I stole medication from one of the patients." She swallowed hard. "I didn't. But the family was powerful, and they needed someone to blame. So they blamed me." Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "No one would hire me after that," she continued. "Every interview, the same question. Why did you leave your last position? And every time I told the truth, I saw it in their eyes. They didn't believe me." She looked up at him. "You were the only one who didn't ask." "Because I didn't care," Ethan thought bitterly. "Because I assumed the worst anyway." "You didn't steal that medication," he said. It wasn't a question. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "No, I didn't." "Then they were wrong." She nodded, pressing her lips together. Ethan felt the weight of his own test settle on his shoulders like a stone. He had assumed she was guilty of something, assumed that kindness was just another con. And all along, she had been carrying the scars of someone else's cruelty. "I'm sorry," he said. Grace shook her head quickly. "You have nothing to apologize for." But he did. He had everything to apologize for. "Thank you for covering me last night," he said quietly. Her eyes widened. "You were awake?" "No, but I saw the footage." The color drained from her face. You recorded me?" Ethan's throat tightened. "Yes." She took a step back, and the hurt in her eyes was worse than any accusation. "Why?" "Because I'm a coward," he said. "Because I've been hurt before and I didn't want to be hurt again. So I tested you, and you passed. But that doesn't make it right." Grace stood very still, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," Ethan said again, and this time he meant it with everything he had. She looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. "Okay. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But acknowledgement." Ethan turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "Grace?" "Yes?" "You won't let me down. I already know that." He left before she could respond. That night, alone in his office, Ethan replayed the footage one last time. Then he deleted it. All of it. The screen went black, and for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Calloway felt something he had almost forgotten. shame, and beneath it, quieter but insistent, hope. Maybe kindness was never the weakness. Maybe it was what I lost. The days that followed moved differently. Ethan couldn't explain it. The house felt the same marble floors, same echoing hallways, same cold perfection. But something had shifted. Or maybe it was him. He found himself noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. The way Grace always arrived 15 minutes early, her uniform pressed and perfect. The way she never accepted tips from guests, no matter how insistent they were. The way she moved through the house like she was trying not to disturb the air itself, and the small things, the things no one else saw. One morning, Ethan passed through the staff lounge and saw Mr. Benson, the elderly driver, asleep in an armchair, his reading glasses still perched on his nose. A soft blanket was draped over him. Grace's work. Another day, Ethan found a vase of fresh wildflowers on the piano in the music room, a room no one used anymore, not since his mother died. The flowers were simple, daisies and clover, but they filled the space with life, Grace again. He started watching her, not through cameras this time, but from a distance, not testing her, just seeing her. She watered plants that weren't part of her job. She reorganized the medicine cabinet in the downstairs bathroom so Mrs. Turner, who had arthritis, could reach the aspirin more easily. She left a small bowl of strawberries on the kitchen counter for the cook, who loved them, but never bought them for himself. Acts of kindness so quiet, they were almost invisible. Ethan had spent 3 years building walls. Grace seemed to spend every day tearing them down without even knowing it. It was Marcus who finally confronted him. "You're doing it again," Marcus said one afternoon, finding Ethan standing by the window, watching Grace tend to the garden below. "Doing what?" "Watching her." Ethan frowned. "I'm not." "You are. And it's starting to get weird." Ethan turned away from the window. "I'm just making sure she's settling in. She's been here a month, she's settled." Marcus crossed his arms. "What's really going on?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone that a woman covering you with a blanket had unraveled something you'd spent years trying to hold together? "She's different," Ethan said finally. "Different how?" "She gives without expecting anything back." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, "And that scares you." Ethan didn't answer. Because it was true. Kindness terrified him. Because if it was real, if people like Grace actually existed, then he had wasted 3 years of his life hiding from something that might have saved him. That evening, Ethan made a decision. He went to his desk, pulled out a plain white envelope, and wrote a single sentence inside on a piece of paper. "Do not refuse. Salary in advance." He tucked $500 inside and sealed it. Then he walked to the staff quarters and slipped it under Grace's door. The next morning, Grace found him in the library. She was holding the envelope. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice tight, "I can't accept this. It's not a gift. It's an advance. I haven't earned it yet." "You've earned it 100 times over." She shook her head, stepping forward. "Please, take it back." "No." Her eyes flashed with something he hadn't seen before, frustration. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve it. You don't even know me." "I know enough." Grace's hands trembled as she held the envelope out to him. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity? Then what is it?" Ethan met her eyes. "Gratitude." The word hung between them. Grace lowered the envelope slowly, her expression softening. "For what?" "For reminding me that not everyone is out to take something from me." Her breath caught. "Keep it," Ethan said gently. "Please." Grace looked down at the envelope, then back at him. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." She turned to leave, but Ethan spoke again. "Grace?" She stopped. "If you ever need anything at all, you can ask me. You don't have to carry everything alone." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something break open in her eyes, something raw and aching. "I'll remember that," she said, and then she left. 2 days later, a storm rolled in. The rain came fast and violent, hammering against the windows, turning the lake into a churning gray mass. Thunder cracked like bones breaking. The lights flickered. Ethan was in his office when he heard the sound, sharp and shattering. Glass. He ran toward the noise and found Grace in the west hallway, standing in front of a broken window. Rain poured through the jagged opening, soaking the floor, the curtains, her uniform. She was trying to cover the window with a plastic tarp, but the wind kept tearing it from her hands. "Grace!" Ethan shouted over the storm. She turned, startled, her hair plastered to her face. "The latch broke. I'm trying to get back." He crossed the space in 3 strides, took the tarp from her hands, and wrestled it over the window. The wind fought him, but he held it in place, securing it with a nearby chair. The rain still leaked through, but it was better. Ethan turned to Grace. She was shivering, her arms wrapped around herself. Without thinking, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "You're soaked," he said. "So are you." He almost smiled. "Come on, let's get you warm." He led her to the emergency kitchen, a small, rarely used space near the staff quarters. It was warmer there, away from the broken window. He found a towel and handed it to her. "Dry off," he said. "I'll make tea." "You don't have to." "I know." He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and waited. The silence between them was different now. Not uncomfortable. Just present. Grace wrapped the towel around her shoulders, still wearing his jacket. She looked small in it, fragile. But there was a strength in her eyes that he was only beginning to understand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You don't have to keep thanking me." "Yes, I do." She looked at him. "You've been kind to me. More than I expected." Ethan poured the tea, handed her a cup. Their fingers brushed, and he felt the warmth of her skin, the pulse beneath it. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Anything." "I don't know how to be soft with people either." Ethan blinked. "What?" "You said that once, in the library. You said you don't know how to be soft." She took a sip of tea. "I feel that way too. Like I've spent so long protecting myself that I forgot how to let anyone in." Ethan stared at her. He had said that, but not out loud. Or had he? "Grace, I know you tested me," she said quietly. "The money, the wallet. I know you were watching." His stomach dropped. "And I understand why," she continued. "Someone hurt you. Someone took something from you. So you stopped trusting." She set down her cup. "I get it. Because someone did the same thing to me." Ethan felt something crack wider inside him. "You don't have to know how to be soft," Grace said. "You just have to feel it." The words settled into him like rain into dry earth. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the kitchen was warm, the light golden, the air thick with steam from the tea. Ethan reached out, slowly, carefully, and his hand found hers on the table. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and neither of them spoke. The hum of the overhead light filled the silence. The rain drummed against the roof. And for the first time in years, Ethan Calloway felt something other than cold. He felt safe. Some storms break the house. Others break what keeps you from feeling. The charity luncheon was Mrs. Turner's idea. "It's good for your image," she'd said, bustling around the kitchen with militant efficiency. "And Lord knows this house could use some life in it." Ethan had agreed, though he hated these events. The forced smiles, the hollow conversations, the way people measured him by the size of his donations rather than the weight of his words. But this time, he had a reason to stay. Grace was working the event. She moved through the grand dining room like a shadow, refilling champagne glasses, clearing plates, always one step ahead of the guests' needs. She wore the same pale blue uniform, but she'd pinned her hair up in a way that made her look older, more composed. Ethan watched her from across the room, and something in his chest tightened. He wasn't the only one watching. Mrs. Victoria Langford, a socialite from Greenwich with too much money and too little compassion, sat at the head of the table. her sharp eyes following Grace's every move. Ethan didn't trust her. Never had. She was one of those people who smiled with their mouth but not their eyes, who donated to charity for the tax write-off and the photo opportunity. The luncheon was going smoothly until dessert. Grace was serving coffee when Mrs. Langford suddenly stood, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the polite chatter. "But I believe this belongs to me." She held up a handkerchief, white silk, embroidered with tiny hummingbirds. The room went silent. Grace froze, the coffee pot still in her hand. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "This handkerchief," Mrs. Langford said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I left it on the side table in the powder room, and now I find it in the hallway. Care to explain?" Grace's face went pale. I was cleaning. I found it and was going to return it to the lost and found." "How convenient." Mrs. Langford's smile was razor sharp. "Or were you planning to keep it?" A murmur rippled through the guests. Ethan's hands clenched into fists under the table. "Mrs. Langford," Grace said, her voice shaking now. "I would never—" "Of course you'd say that." Mrs. Langford turned to the other guests, playing to the audience. "You can't trust these people. Give them an inch and they'll take everything." "That's enough." Ethan stood, his voice cold as steel. The room turned to him. "Mr. Calloway," Mrs. Langford said, her smile faltering, "I'm simply pointing out you're accusing one of my employees of theft based on nothing," Ethan said, "without evidence, without proof, based entirely on your own assumptions." "I have the handkerchief," which she was returning to you, she says, and I believe her. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Langford's face flushed red. "You can't be serious." "Grace," Ethan said, turning to her, "did you take the handkerchief with the intent to keep it?" "No, sir," she said, her voice barely audible. "Then that's the end of it." He looked back at Mrs. Langford. "I think it's time for you to leave." Mrs. Langford sputtered. "You're throwing me out over some maid?" "I'm asking you to leave because you've insulted someone under my roof, and I won't tolerate it." For a moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Langford grabbed her purse, shot Grace a withering look, and stormed out of the dining room. The other guests exchanged glances, unsure whether to stay or follow. "Please," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "Enjoy your dessert." Slowly, the conversation resumed, but Ethan's eyes were on Grace. She stood frozen, the coffee pot still in her hand, tears streaming silently down her face. He crossed the room in 3 strides. "Grace," he said quietly, "come with me." He led her to the library, the one place in the house that felt like sanctuary. Grace sank into one of the armchairs, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. Ethan poured her a glass of water and handed it to her. "Drink," he said gently. She did, her breath hitching. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for." "She accused me in front of everyone." Grace's voice broke, just like before, just like Hartford. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Tell me what happened. The truth. All of it." Grace looked up at him, and the pain in her eyes was so raw it made his chest ache. "I worked at a nursing home," she said quietly. "Sunrise Manor. I loved it there. I loved the residents. One of them, Mrs. Whitmore. She was like a grandmother to me." Grace's hands trembled. "She had early-stage dementia. Her daughter Jennifer barely visited. But when Mrs. Whitmore's pain medication went missing, Jennifer blamed me." "Did you take it?" "No." Grace's voice cracked. "I would never. But Jennifer was rich, connected. She threatened to sue unless they fired me. So they did. And she made sure I couldn't get another job in elder care. She told every nursing home in the state that I was a thief." Ethan felt a cold rage settle in his bones. "I lost everything," Grace continued. "My job, my reputation, my ability to work in the field I loved." She wiped her eyes. "And the worst part? Mrs. Whitmore asked for me, for weeks. But they wouldn't let me see her. She died thinking I'd abandoned her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan knelt in front of her chair, his hands resting gently on the armrests, his face level with hers. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce. "What happened to you was wrong. Jennifer Whitmore was wrong. Mrs. Langford was wrong. And every person who refused to believe you was wrong." Grace's tears fell harder now. "You are not a thief," Ethan continued. "You are not unworthy, and you are not invisible. Not to me." She looked at him, and something shifted in her expression, disbelief giving way to fragile hope. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she whispered. "Because you deserve it," he said simply, "and because I should have been from the beginning." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the handkerchief, Mrs. Langford's handkerchief. He must have picked it up from the hallway without realizing it. "Here," he said, pressing it into her hands. "Keep it, or burn it. I don't care. But don't let her take anything else from you." Grace stared at the handkerchief, then at him. And then, for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. A real smile, small, fragile, but real. "Thank you," she said. Ethan stood, but he didn't step away. "Grace." "Yes?" "If anyone ever treats you like that again, anyone, I want you to tell me, immediately." She nodded, clutching the handkerchief to her chest. Ethan left her there in the library, surrounded by books and light. But as he walked back to his office, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, not in himself, in her. That night, alone in his room, Ethan sat by the window and looked out at the lake. The handkerchief sat on the table beside him, the one Mrs. Langford had accused Grace of stealing. He picked it up, ran his fingers over the embroidered hummingbirds, and he thought about the woman who had been accused of theft twice in her life, both times by people who had more power and less compassion. "She didn't just clean my house, she's cleaning something in me." Something had changed after the luncheon, not just in the house, but in the way people moved through it. The staff, who had always treated Grace with polite indifference, now nodded to her in the hallways. Mrs. Turner asked her opinion on the weekly menu. Mr. Benson invited her to sit with him during lunch breaks. And Ethan couldn't stop thinking about her. It wasn't just attraction, though he'd be lying if he said he didn't notice the way sunlight caught in her hair, or the way her smile, rare as it was, made something warm unfurl in his chest. It was something deeper. Something that scared him more than desire ever could. Respect, admiration, trust. 3 things he'd sworn he'd never give anyone again. It started with tea. One afternoon, instead of eating alone in his office, Ethan walked down to the staff dining room and sat at the long wooden table where the employees took their breaks. The room went silent. Mrs. Turner dropped her spoon. Mr. Benson nearly choked on his sandwich. And Grace, sitting in the corner with a book open in her lap, looked up in alarm. "Mr. Calloway," Mrs. Turner said, recovering quickly. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Ethan said, pouring himself tea from the communal pot. "I just thought I'd join you." "Here?" Mrs. Turner sounded genuinely baffled. "In the staff room? Is that not allowed?" "Well, no, it's just unusual." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe it shouldn't be." He sat down beside Mr. Benson and took a sip of tea. It was terrible, oversteeped and bitter, but he drank it anyway. Slowly, the conversation resumed. Mrs. Turner complained about a broken dishwasher. Mr. Benson told a story about a time he'd driven Ethan's father to a business meeting and gotten lost in New Jersey. The cook grumbled about rising food costs, and Grace said nothing. She just sat in her corner, watching Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite read. After a while, Ethan stood, rinsed his cup in the sink, and nodded to the room. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me join you." Mrs. Turner blinked. "Of course, sir." As he left, he caught Grace's eye. She was smiling, just a little. Just enough. The next day, Ethan called Grace to his office. She arrived 10 minutes later looking nervous. You wanted to see me, Mr. Calloway? Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She sat, hands folded in her lap. Ethan leaned back in his chair. I have a project for you, if you're interested. A project. The library, he said. It's a mess. Books out of order, some damaged, some missing. I'd like someone to catalog everything, reorganize it, make it usable again. Grace's eyes widened. You want me to do that? I can't think of anyone better. But I'm not a librarian. No, but you care about books. I can see it in the way you handle them. He paused. Will you do it? She hesitated. That's a huge responsibility. I trust you with it. The words hung between them, heavier than he'd intended. Grace looked down at her hands. Okay, she said softly. I'll do it. Good. Ethan opened a drawer and pulled out a set of keys. These will give you access to the rare book collection on the 3rd floor. Some of those volumes are over 200 years old. Be careful with them. Grace took the keys and her fingers brushed his. The touch lasted only a second, but Ethan felt it like an electric current. Thank you, she said, for trusting me. You've earned it. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mr. Calloway? Yes? Why are you doing this? He could have given her a dozen reasons. Because she deserved meaningful work. Because the library needed organizing. Because he wanted to see what she would do with the space. But the truth was simpler. Because I want you to stay, he said quietly. Grace's breath caught. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll do my best, she said. And then she was gone. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace transformed the library. She worked early in the morning and late into the evening, sorting books by subject, repairing damaged spines, dusting shelves that hadn't been touched in years. She created a handwritten catalog, meticulous, organized, beautiful. And Ethan found excuses to visit her. He'd bring her tea, ask her opinion on where to place certain volumes, sit in one of the armchairs and read while she worked, the silence between them comfortable and warm. One afternoon, he arrived to find her standing by the window, staring out at the garden. Grace? She turned, and he saw tears on her face. What's wrong? He asked, crossing the room. Nothing, she said quickly, wiping her eyes. I'm sorry, I was thinking. About what? She hesitated. About what you said. That day in the rain. You said you didn't know how to be soft with people. Ethan's chest tightened. I remember. I've been thinking about that, she continued. About what it means to be soft, to let people in. She looked out at the garden again. I think it means being willing to break, to be vulnerable, even when it's terrifying. Ethan stepped closer. And is it? Terrifying? Yes. Why? She turned to face him, and the look in her eyes was raw. Because if I let myself care about this place, about these people, about you, and then I lose it. Her voice cracked. I don't think I could survive that again. Ethan's hand moved before he could stop it, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek. You won't lose it, he said quietly. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'll do everything I can to make sure you feel safe here. Grace closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. They stood like that for a long moment, his hand on her face, her breath warm against his palm. Then, from somewhere downstairs, a door slammed. The sound broke the spell. Grace stepped back, and Ethan let his hand fall. I should get back to work, she said, her voice unsteady. Grace, please, she whispered. Not yet. He understood. Some things needed time. So he nodded and left her to her books. But as he walked down the hallway, he heard her voice, soft and wistful, drifting through the open door. If I can bring peace to someone's day, even just by wiping a window, that's a life worth living. Ethan stopped, turned, and in that moment, he realized something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He was falling in love with her. That night, another storm rolled in. Ethan stood by his bedroom window, watching the rain lash against the glass. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the lake in brief, violent flashes. He was about to turn away when he saw her, Grace, standing in the garden, her face tilted up to the rain. She wasn't running for cover. She was just standing there, arms outstretched, eyes closed, as if the storm was washing something away. Ethan's breath caught. He should leave her alone, let her have this moment, but he couldn't. He grabbed a coat and ran downstairs, out into the rain. "Grace!" She turned, startled. Her hair was soaked, her uniform clinging to her frame. "What are you doing out here?" he shouted over the thunder. "I needed to feel something," she shouted back. "You'll catch pneumonia." "I don't care." He closed the distance between them in 3 strides, grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the greenhouse, a glass structure near the edge of the garden. Inside, the rain hammered against the roof, creating a cocoon of sound. It was warmer here, humid, filled with the smell of earth and growing things. Grace stood in the center of the space, dripping water onto the stone floor, her chest heaving. "What were you thinking?" Ethan demanded, though his voice had lost its edge. "I was thinking," she said, her voice breaking, "that I've spent my whole life being careful, being small, being invisible, and I'm tired of it. Grace, I'm tired of being afraid," she continued, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Afraid of losing my job, afraid of being accused, afraid of letting anyone close enough to hurt me." She looked at him. "But you make me want to stop being afraid." Ethan's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "You scare me too," he said quietly. "Why?" "Because you make me feel things I thought I'd buried, things I swore I'd never feel again." He stepped closer. "And because I don't know what to do with that." The rain pounded against the glass. Lightning flashed, illuminating their faces. Grace reached up, her hand trembling, and touched his cheek. "Then don't do anything," she whispered. "Just feel it." Ethan leaned into her touch, his eyes closing. They stood there inches apart, the storm raging around them. And then the thunder cracked, so loud it shook the greenhouse. Grace flinched, and the moment shattered. Ethan stepped back, running a hand through his wet hair. "We should get inside. You need to dry off." Grace nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. They walked back to the house in silence, the rain soaking them both. But something had shifted between them. Something that couldn't be taken back. Some storms break the house, others break what keeps you from feeling. The Callaway Foundation Charity Gala was the event of the season. 500 guests, black tie, a string quartet playing in the ballroom, champagne flowing like water. Ethan hated every second of it. He stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces, all of them waiting for him to speak, to tell them about the foundation his mother had started, to thank them for their donations, to play the role of the benevolent billionaire. But his mind was elsewhere, on Grace, who was somewhere in the crowd, serving champagne, invisible to everyone but him. He'd been rehearsing this speech for weeks, but now, standing under the lights, the words felt hollow. "Good evening," he began, his voice echoing through the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight. The Callaway Foundation was my mother's greatest passion. She believed that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to lift others up." Polite applause. Ethan paused, looking down at his notes. Then he folded them and set them aside. "But I'm not here to talk about my mother's legacy," he said. "I'm here to talk about someone else. Someone who reminded me what that legacy actually means." The room went quiet. "There's a person in this room who works harder than anyone I've ever met, who shows up early and stays late, who performs acts of kindness so small and so constant that most people never notice them." Ethan's eyes scanned the crowd until they found her. Grace, standing near the back, her eyes wide with shock. This person was falsely accused, publicly humiliated, lost everything, and yet, instead of becoming bitter, she became kinder. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "I set a trap for this person," Ethan continued, his voice rougher now. I tested her integrity because I'd forgotten what integrity looked like, and she passed. Not because she knew she was being watched, but because kindness was who she is. Tears streamed down Grace's face. My mother used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when the world is watching. It's what they do when no one is. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Tonight, I'd like to honor someone who embodies that principle. Grace Miller, would you please come up here? The room erupted in whispers. Grace shook her head, trying to disappear into the crowd, but Mrs. Turner gently pushed her forward, and slowly, reluctantly, she made her way to the stage. Ethan extended his hand, and she took it, her fingers trembling. He opened the velvet box, revealing a silver pendant, simple, elegant, with a small hummingbird engraved on it. This belonged to my mother, Ethan said quietly, so only Grace could hear. She wore it every day, and I can't think of anyone who deserves to carry her legacy more than you. Ethan, Grace whispered, using his first name for the first time. I can't. Please. She looked at him, tears spilling over, and nodded. He clasped the pendant around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin. The room applauded, but Ethan barely heard it. All he could see was Grace, looking up at him with an expression that made his chest ache. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, he said back. For everything. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ethan made his rounds, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. But his eyes kept finding Grace, who had retreated to the shadows again, the pendant gleaming at her throat. It wasn't until the gala ended and the guests began to leave that Marcus pulled him aside. That was quite a speech, Marcus said. I meant every word. I know you did. Marcus paused. She's good for you, you know. Grace. Ethan didn't respond. Don't let her slip away, Marcus said quietly. People like her don't come around often. Ethan nodded, but a cold weight had settled in his stomach. Because later that night, when he went to find Grace to drive her home himself, Mrs. Turner stopped him in the hallway. She's gone, sir, Mrs. Turner said, her voice strange. What do you mean? Gone. She left about an hour ago. Took her things, said she had to go. Ethan's blood ran cold. Where? I don't know. She wouldn't say. He ran to the staff quarters, threw open the door to Grace's room. It was empty. The bed was made. The closet was bare. The only thing left was a single envelope on the pillow, addressed to him. Ethan tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a letter, handwritten in Grace's careful script. Dear Ethan, I found something today. A letter. It was in my locker, from the Callaway Foundation, a full scholarship for nursing school. I don't know how it happened. I don't know who arranged it, but I have a feeling I do. I can't stay here, not because I'm unhappy, but because if I stay, I'll never be brave enough to leave. And I need to do this. For me. For the woman I want to become. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked through me. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for giving me my dignity back. I'll never forget you. Grace Ethan's hands clenched around the letter, crumpling the edges. He looked at his watch. 11:47 p.m. The last train to Hartford left at midnight. He ran. The rain had started again by the time Ethan reached the station. He sprinted through the parking lot, his dress shoes slipping on the wet pavement, his heart hammering in his chest. The platform was nearly empty. A few stragglers huddled under the overhang, waiting. And there, at the far end, was Grace. She stood with a small suitcase at her feet, the pendant still around her neck, her coat pulled tight against the cold. Grace! Ethan shouted. She turned, her eyes widening. He ran to her, breathless, soaked from the rain. Don't go, he said. Ethan, don't go, please. I have to, she said, tears already streaming down her face. This is my chance. I have to take it. I know. He swallowed hard. I know. And I'm not asking you to give it up. I'm just asking you to know that you always have a home, with me, whenever you're ready. Grace's face crumpled. You don't understand. If I stay, even for one more day, I won't be able to leave, and I need to do this. I need to prove to myself that I can. You don't have to prove anything. Yes, I do. The train's whistle sounded in the distance. Ethan reached out, cupped her face in his hands. Then go. Go and become everything you're meant to be. But know that I'll be waiting. However long it takes. Ethan, I love you, he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. I love you, Grace Miller. And I don't care if it's too soon or too complicated or too anything. I needed you to know. Grace sobbed, pressing her forehead against his. I love you too. God, I love you too. The train pulled into the station, its brakes screeching. All aboard, the conductor called. Grace pulled back, her hands trembling as she picked up her suitcase. Go, Ethan said, though it felt like the word was tearing him apart. Go. She kissed him, quick and desperate, and then she was running, climbing onto the train just as the doors began to close. Ethan stood on the platform, rain pouring down, watching as the train began to move. Grace appeared at the window, her hand pressed against the glass. He raised his hand, and she did the same. And then the train rounded the corner, and she was gone. Ethan stood there for a long time, water streaming down his face, mixing with tears he didn't try to hide. 6 weeks later, Grace walked across the campus of Hartford School of Nursing, her textbooks tucked under her arm. The scholarship had covered everything: tuition, housing, books. It was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. But there was an emptiness in her chest that no amount of success could fill. She missed him. She missed the library, the staff room, the lake, the greenhouse. She missed home. One afternoon, as she crossed the quad, she noticed a new plaque on the administration building: Donor Recognition Callaway Foundation. Major. Sponsor. Ethan Callaway. Grace stopped, her breath catching. Of course, she should have known. Beautiful, isn't it? She turned, and her heart stopped. Ethan stood behind her, hands in his pockets, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. He looked different out here. Softer, younger, more human. What are you doing here? She whispered. I came to see how you're doing. You could have called. I wanted to see your face when I said it. Said what? He stepped closer, and she saw something in his eyes that made her knees weak. I said the house would always be there, he said quietly. Turns out it doesn't matter where the house is, as long as you are. Grace's vision blurred with tears. I bought a place, Ethan continued. Small, just outside Hartford. Close enough that you can study. Far enough that you can breathe. He smiled. There's a greenhouse, and a library, and a room with your name on it, whenever you're ready. Ethan! I'm not asking you to come back, he said. I'm asking if I can come with you, wherever you go, for as long as you'll have me. Grace dropped her textbooks, and then she was in his arms, sobbing into his chest, holding him like he might disappear. Yes, she whispered. Yes, yes, yes. He held her tighter, burying his face in her hair. And as the wind rose, a white handkerchief, embroidered with a golden hummingbird, fluttered from her bag and danced away across the grass. Neither of them noticed. They were too busy holding on to each other, too busy building a home that had nothing to do with walls. 3 years later, the greenhouse by the lake had become their sanctuary. It was late afternoon, and golden light poured through the glass, turning everything soft and warm. White jasmine climbed the walls, its fragrance thick and sweet. Grace knelt in the soil, planting new bulbs, her hands dirty and her hair tied back in a messy bun. She wore jeans and one of Ethan's old sweaters, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The silver pendant, his mother's pendant, still hung around her neck. Ethan stood at the small sink in the corner, washing dishes from their lunch. He'd learned to cook over the past few years. Nothing fancy, but enough. You missed a spot, Grace called over her shoulder, grinning. You're one to talk, he shot back. You have dirt on your nose. She wiped at it with the back of her hand, smearing it worse. They both laughed. It was such a simple moment, so ordinary. And yet, Ethan had never been happier in his entire life. Grace finished planting the last bulb and stood dusting off her knees. She crossed to the sink and stood beside him, watching as he rinsed the final plate. "You know," she said softly, 3 years ago, if someone had told me this is where I'd be, I wouldn't have believed them." "Why not?" "Because I didn't think I deserved it." Ethan set down the plate and turned to her. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I know I do. Because you taught me that kindness isn't something you have to earn. It's something you give and receive freely." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You taught me the same thing." They stood there side by side, sunlight streaming through the glass. "I have something for you," Grace said suddenly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Ethan took it, curious, and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a handkerchief, white linen, embroidered with a golden hummingbird, and beneath it, their initials, EC and GM. "I made it," she said shyly. "Well, Mrs. Turner helped, but I did most of it." Ethan stared at the handkerchief, his throat tight. "It's perfect," he said. "There's something on the back," Grace added. He turned it over. Embroidered in tiny, careful stitches were the words, "For the man who learned to be gentle." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she laughed. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you too." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, surrounded by jasmine and light. Outside, the lake shimmered. A hummingbird hovered near the window, its wings a blur, before darting away. And inside the greenhouse, two people who had once been invisible to the world, who had been broken and accused and forgotten, stood together, healing each other one quiet moment at a time. Grace pulled back just enough to look up at him. "You know what I realized?" "What?" "We're not in your house anymore, or my dorm, or the estate." "No," Ethan agreed. "We're not. So where are we?" He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Home." She kissed him then, soft and slow and full of promise. And when they finally pulled apart, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Some houses are built of stone," she whispered. "Others," Ethan finished, his voice rough with emotion, "are built of the hands that learn to be gentle." They stood there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Two people who had found each other in the darkness. Two people who had built a home out of kindness. Two people who had learned, finally, to be soft. If this story moved you, leave your like and share it with someone who believes in second.